In the pristine suburb of Millbrook Heights, a grieving widow was about to face the cruelest words a mother could hear. What started as a routine family visit took a shocking turn when her son declared she had nothing left to give. Cecilia Thompson wasn't your typical vulnerable senior citizen. For 37 years, she had built a real estate empire, known for her sharp business acumen and unwavering family loyalty. When she encountered her neighbor's selfless kindness, she had no idea she was walking into the most radical decision of her life. What began as heartless dismissal would become community-shaking justice when a $400,000 inheritance found truly deserving hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Cecilia Thompson sat in William's chair, though she told herself she wasn't. She was simply positioned in the leather recliner that faced the bay window, overlooking the carefully manicured grounds of their Millbrook Heights estate. The chair that had molded itself to her husband's frame over 37 years of marriage now seemed to swallow her smaller form, leaving her feeling more diminished than comforted. 6 months. Half a year since the funeral, since the endless parade of casseroles and condolences, since the house had settled into its new rhythm of silence. The grandfather clock in the hallway still chimed every hour, but the sound seemed hollow now, marking time that stretched endlessly ahead of her. The doorbell's sharp ring cut through her reverie. Through the window she could see David's BMW in the circular drive, its polished surface reflecting the autumn sun. Her son stood at the front door, shifting his weight from foot to foot in that way he'd done since childhood when he wanted something. At 42, David still carried himself with the practiced confidence of a successful marketing executive. But Cecilia had learned to read the subtle signs of strain around his eyes, the slight tension in his shoulders that spoke of troubles he preferred to handle privately. "David," she said as she opened the door, genuinely pleased despite the circumstances of his recent visits. "I wasn't expecting you today." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his expensive cologne preceding him into the foyer. "Just thought I'd check on you, Mom, see how you're holding up." But his eyes were already scanning the room, taking inventory in that calculating way that had become familiar. They settled in the living room, David choosing the sofa that positioned him across from her chair. He declined her offer of coffee, which should have been her first warning. David never refused her Ethiopian blend, a small luxury he'd developed a taste for during his college years. "The house feels too big for just you," he said, his tone carrying what might have been concern to a casual observer. But Cecilia had raised this man, had watched him perfect the art of appearing thoughtful while calculating his advantage. "It's the same size it's always been," she replied mildly, settling back into William's chair. "Perhaps I've simply grown smaller." David leaned forward, his hands clasped in the gesture he used during client presentations. "That's actually something I wanted to talk to you about. Your situation here. The expenses, the maintenance, the property taxes." "My situation is fine, David." "Is it though?" His voice carried an edge now, the veneer of concern beginning to crack. "Dad's been gone 6 months. The estate's been settled. You're living alone in a house that costs more to maintain than most people make in a year." Cecilia studied her son's face, noting the flush creeping up his neck, the way his fingers drummed against his knee. "Are you having financial difficulties again?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. David's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she saw the little boy who used to storm to his room when caught in a lie. "This isn't about me," he said, but his voice had risen half an octave. "This is about being practical, about making smart decisions with what Dad left behind. What your father left behind was intended for you. Eventually, as we discussed with Patricia when we updated our wills." "Eventually." David stood abruptly, beginning to pace the room with the agitation of a caged animal. "Mom, I'm 42 years old. I have obligations. Responsibilities. Jenny's threatening to take me back to court over the kids' expenses, the company's restructuring, and I'm drowning here." There it was. The truth beneath the veneer of filial concern. Cecilia felt something cold settle in her stomach, a recognition she'd been avoiding for months. "I've already helped you with the divorce settlement," she said quietly, "and the down payment on your condo." And Jennifer's medical bills when Emma broke her arm. That was different. David's pacing had brought him to the mantelpiece, where wedding photos and family portraits created a gallery of happier times. Those were emergencies. This is about securing the future. Whose future? The question stopped him mid-stride. When he turned to face her, his expression had shifted into something she didn't recognize. Something harder, more calculating. I need access to the trust, Mom. Not all of it, just enough to get me back on solid ground. Dad would have understood. Your father specifically structured that trust to vest when you turned 45, David. He believed you needed time to mature, to develop genuine financial responsibility. Mature? The word came out like a slap. I'm a grown man with a career, with children of my own. I don't need to wait 3 more years for some arbitrary deadline Dad set because he didn't trust me. William trusted you enough to leave you $400,000. In 3 years. What good does that do me now? Cecilia rose from the chair, her movements deliberate and careful. At 67, she'd learned the value of measured responses, of thinking before speaking. But David's agitation was infectious, filling the room with an energy that made her skin prickle. David, I understand you're under pressure. Do you? He whirled to face her, his composure finally cracking completely. Do you really understand? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're hoarding money while your only son struggles to keep his head above water. The accusation hit her like a physical blow. Hoarding? Living in this mausoleum, counting every penny like some kind of miser while I'm about to lose everything I've worked for. Dad's gone, Mom. He's not coming back to approve or disapprove of what you do with his money. It's not his money anymore, Cecilia said, her voice growing stronger. It's mine. And yours, when the time comes. When the time comes. David's laugh was bitter, ugly. And what if the time never comes for me? What if I lose my business, my apartment, any chance of providing for my kids because I was too proud to ask my own mother for help? You're not asking for help, David. You're demanding it. Because I have no choice. The words exploded from him with a force that made Cecilia step backward. Because I'm desperate. And you're my mother, and you're supposed to care about that. The silence that followed seemed to echo with the weight of 30 years' worth of similar conversations. Cecilia saw them all suddenly, stretching back through David's adult life. The car payments when he'd overspent his first salary, the credit card debt from his engagement to Jennifer, the business loan that had gone bad, the down payment on the house he couldn't afford. Always presented as emergencies, as temporary setbacks that just required a small intervention from the family funds. I do care, she said finally, which is why I've helped you before. Multiple times. But this pattern. Pattern? David's face was flushed now, his voice rising to a pitch that would have embarrassed him in any other circumstance. There's no pattern here except a son asking his mother for support when he needs it most. And what happens after this time? When the money runs out again, when the next crisis hits. Do I liquidate more assets? Sell the house? Give you everything until there's nothing left? David stopped pacing. Something in his expression shifted, hardened into a look of cold calculation that chilled her. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing, he said quietly. Maybe it's time you stopped pretending Dad's coming home and started living in reality. The cruelty of the statement took her breath away. But David wasn't finished. Face it, Mom. You're 77? 67. You're alone in a house you can't maintain, clinging to a life that doesn't exist anymore. You have nothing left to give because you're giving it all to the past. The words hung in the air like a curse. Cecilia felt them settling into her bones, cold and sharp and somehow familiar. Because hadn't she thought the same thing? In the dark hours before dawn? When sleep wouldn't come? Hadn't she wondered if David was right? If she was simply a relic haunting a house too big for her grief? Nothing left to give, she repeated softly. I didn't mean, David began, but the damage was done. She could see it in his eyes. The moment when he realized he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Yes, you did. Cecilia's voice was steady now, clearer than it had been in months. You meant every word. David's face cycled through expressions, regret, defiance, calculation. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted into damage control mode. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm under a lot of stress right now, and I shouldn't have. You should go. Let me explain." "David." She looked at him directly, seeing him perhaps more clearly than she had in years. "You should go now." For a moment, she thought he might argue, might try to salvage something from the wreckage of the conversation. But David had always been astute about reading rooms, about knowing when a pitch had failed. "This isn't over," he said as he gathered his coat. "I'm still your son. This family still means something, even if you've forgotten that." He was halfway to the door when the doorbell rang again. Through the side window, Cecilia could see Sarah Mitchell on the front step, holding what appeared to be a covered pot. David's expression darkened as he recognized their neighbor. "Perfect," he muttered. "The whole neighborhood can witness your dramatic rejection of your only child." Cecilia moved past him to the door, her movement suddenly purposeful. Sarah stood on the threshold, holding a soup pot, her expression immediately concerned as she took in David's flushed face and aggressive posture. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, stepping back slightly. "I didn't realize you had company. I just thought, with the weather turning cold." "Don't mind me," David said, pushing past both women. "I was just leaving. Apparently, my mother has no use for family anymore." Sarah's eyes widened at the venom in his voice, but she said nothing as David strode to his BMW and gunned the engine with unnecessary force. The car's tires left black marks on the pristine driveway as he accelerated toward the street. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, turning back to Cecilia with genuine distress in her dark eyes. "I had no idea I was interrupting something important." "You weren't interrupting anything important," Cecilia replied, and realized as she said it that it was absolutely true. "You were preventing something unimportant from continuing." Sarah's smile was uncertain but warm. "I brought chicken and dumplings. I made too much again. Occupational hazard of cooking for a family when you're used to feeding crowds. But if this is a bad time, it's a perfect time." Cecilia stepped aside to let her neighbor enter, noting how Sarah wiped her feet carefully on the mat, how she held the pot with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in kitchens. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot. I don't want to impose." "Sarah." Cecilia's voice carried a firmness that surprised them both. "You're not imposing. You're rescuing." As they moved toward the kitchen, Cecilia found herself studying this woman who had become such a quiet presence in her life over the past months. Sarah was 34, she knew, though she carried herself with the purposeful efficiency of someone older. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes, jeans and a sweater that had seen better days, spoke of someone for whom fashion was secondary to function. "The twins told me to tell you they finally finished that calculus homework you helped Jake with," Sarah said as she set the pot on the stove. "He's convinced he actually understands derivatives now, which is more than I can claim." Cecilia felt a smile tugging at her lips, the first genuine expression of pleasure she'd experienced in days. "Jake's brilliant. He just needs confidence in his abilities." "You're good with them," Sarah said, accepting a mug of coffee with obvious gratitude. "They light up when they talk about you. Emma keeps asking when you might have time to look at her portfolio for the art school applications." "Anytime. I enjoy their company." It was true, Cecilia realized. In the months since William's death, the Mitchell twins had become bright spots in her increasingly gray world. Jake with his quiet intensity and surprising insights, Emma with her fierce creativity and unguarded enthusiasm. They treated her not as a fragile widow to be handled carefully, but as a person worthy of their genuine affection and respect. "They feel the same way about you," Sarah said softly. "We all do." The simple statement hung in the air between them, and Cecilia felt something shift in her chest. Here was someone offering companionship without agenda, kindness without calculation. The contrast with David's visit was so stark it was almost physically painful. "I should let you get back to your evening," Sarah said, misreading Cecilia's silence. "I know you value your privacy." "Do I?" Cecilia heard herself ask. "Is that what I value?" Sarah paused, her coffee mug halfway to her lips. I don't know. Is it?" "I thought it was," Cecilia said slowly. "But now I'm wondering if what I called privacy was really just isolation. and what I called independence might have been loneliness. The words surprised her with their honesty. She'd spoken truths she hadn't even admitted to herself, certainly not to someone she'd known for only 5 years. But something about Sarah's presence, her complete lack of judgment, her natural warmth, made confession feel safe. "The house is too big," Cecilia continued, echoing David's earlier words but giving them different meaning. Not because of the expense or the maintenance, but because it echoes with memories that have nowhere to go. Sarah set down her mug and leaned forward slightly, her attention complete and genuine. "What kind of memories?" "Good ones, mostly. That's what makes it so hard. William and I were happy here. We built something beautiful together. Not just the house, but a life. And now—" She gestured helplessly at the immaculate kitchen, the perfect proportions that suddenly felt more like a museum than a home. "Now it feels like a monument to something that's over," Sarah finished quietly. "Exactly." Cecilia looked at this woman who somehow understood without lengthy explanation. "My son thinks I should sell it, move somewhere smaller, more practical. But he doesn't understand that it's not about the house. It's about what happens when you realize that the person you were, wife, mother, partner, might not exist anymore." "But you're still all those things," Sarah said with gentle conviction. "William's death didn't erase who you were to him. And David is still your son, even when he's being—" She paused, searching for diplomatic words. "Cruel?" Cecilia supplied. "Entitled? Manipulative?" Sarah's expression grew carefully neutral. "I wouldn't presume to judge your relationship with your son. But you have eyes," Cecilia said with a dry humor that surprised them both. "You saw him storm out of here like a toddler denied a toy." "I saw someone under pressure," Sarah said diplomatically. "We all handle stress differently." It was a generous interpretation, Cecilia thought. More generous than David deserved, certainly more generous than she felt capable of at the moment. But it was also typically Sarah, looking for the best in people, giving them the benefit of doubt they hadn't necessarily earned. "You're very kind," Cecilia said. "Kinder than most people would be in your position." "My position? Working 2 jobs to support your children while watching your neighbor's adult son demand money he hasn't earned." Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly. "My situation is different. David has opportunities I've never had, resources I can't provide for Jake and Emma. It's not really comparable. Isn't it?" Cecilia studied Sarah's face, noting the carefully controlled expression, the way she deflected attention from her own struggles. "You work nights at the hospital, weekends catering events, and somehow still find time to bring soup to a lonely old woman and help a 16-year-old with calculus. When was the last time someone took care of you?" The question clearly caught Sarah off guard. She blinked, her coffee mug suspended in midair as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. "That's not really how my life works," she said finally. "Why not?" "Because I'm the mother. I'm the one who takes care of other people." "So was I," Cecilia said softly. "But I'm learning that there's a difference between taking care of people and enabling them. Between supporting someone and being used by them." The words felt profound as she spoke them, as if she were discovering their truth in real time. David's visit had crystallized something she'd been sensing for months, a growing awareness that their relationship had become transactional, that his love came with conditions and expectations she was no longer sure she wanted to meet. "I should go," Sarah said, though she made no move to leave. "You've had a difficult evening, and you probably want to be alone." Quote, "Do I?" Cecilia asked again, and this time she knew the answer. "No, I don't think I do. I think I've been alone long enough." Sarah's smile was radiant, transforming her tired face into something luminous. "In that case, would you like me to heat up some of that soup? I may have mentioned that I made too much, and it's always better shared." As Sarah moved around her kitchen with easy familiarity, Cecilia found herself observing the differences between this interaction and the one with David. Where her son had filled the space with demands and accusations, Sarah brought peaceful energy and genuine concern. Where David had seen her grief as weakness to be exploited, Sarah treated it as a natural response that deserved respect and patience. The soup was indeed perfect. Rich, comforting, seasoned with the kind of care that couldn't be purchased. As they ate, Sarah shared stories about her day. A difficult patient at the hospital who'd finally smiled. Emma's excitement about a scholarship application. Jake's quiet pride in his improving grades. Small moments, ordinary triumphs, the currency of a life lived with attention and gratitude. "You're raising remarkable children," Cecilia said, as Sarah gathered the empty bowls. "They're raising themselves, mostly. I just try to stay out of their way and provide occasional guidance." "That's what good parents do," Cecilia replied, and felt the truth of it settle in her chest. They create space for their children to become who they're meant to be, not who the parents need them to be. Sarah paused in her cleaning, her hands still in the soapy water. "That sounds like hard-won wisdom." "The hardest kind," Cecilia agreed. "The kind you only recognize when it's too late to use it properly." But even as she said it, she wondered if it really was too late. David's words echoed in her mind. "You have nothing left to give." He'd meant it as an accusation, a criticism of her diminished utility to him. But what if he was wrong? What if she had plenty left to give, just not to him? As Sarah prepared to leave, gathering her coat and the now empty soup pot, Cecilia felt the house settling back into its familiar quiet. But the silence felt different now, less oppressive and more contemplative. "Thank you," she said as they stood at the front door. "For the soup, for the company, for everything." "Thank you for letting me stay," Sarah replied. "I know you were expecting a quiet evening." "I was," Cecilia agreed. "But I'm learning that what we expect and what we need aren't always the same thing." After Sarah left, Cecilia returned to William's chair. Her chair now, she corrected herself, and looked out at the grounds they'd tended together for so many years. The autumn light was fading, casting long shadows across the lawn. But instead of melancholy, she felt something that might have been possibility. David's words had been intended to wound, to make her feel small and useless. But they'd accomplished something else entirely. They'd shown her the difference between conditional love and unconditional kindness, between being needed and being valued, between family by blood and family by choice. She thought about Sarah declining her offers of help despite clearly needing it, about Jake's careful questions and Emma's unbridled enthusiasm, about the quiet grace with which the Mitchell family navigated their challenges. They asked for nothing but gave freely, exactly the opposite of David's approach to relationships. "You have nothing left to give," she murmured to the empty room, testing the words in the growing darkness. But as she sat in the chair that had been William's and was now hers, in the house that had been theirs and was now hers, surrounded by the life they'd built together and she was now reshaping alone, Cecilia thought that perhaps David had never been more wrong about anything in his life. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its deep voice no longer hollow, but somehow promising. Time was passing, yes, but not just marking loss. It was also creating opportunity, opening space for new relationships, different kinds of love, chosen rather than assumed family. For the first time in months, Cecilia Thompson smiled in the growing darkness and began to consider what she might have left to give, and to whom. The grandfather clock had chimed midnight before Cecilia finally left William's chair and made her way upstairs. Sleep proved elusive, and she found herself standing at the bedroom window, watching the Mitchell house across their shared property line. A single light glowed in what she knew was Sarah's kitchen, where the woman was likely preparing for another early morning shift at the hospital. The sight stirred something in Cecilia's chest, a recognition of quiet dedication she'd once known intimately. She and William had spent countless nights like this in their early years, one of them working late while the other stole a few hours of rest before the next day's challenges. Cecilia pulled William's robe tighter and settled into the window seat. The fabric still held the faintest trace of his cologne, a detail that would have reduced her to tears months ago. Tonight it felt like companionship rather than loss. "What would you think of tonight?" she wondered, addressing the question to the darkness where William's presence felt most real. The answer came not in mystical communication but in memory, rising from 37 years of shared conversations. William's voice, patient but troubled, from one of their last real talks before his illness had stolen his clarity. "I'm worried about David," he'd said, sitting in that same chair downstairs, fingers drumming against the armrest. "Not just the money, though that's part of it. I'm worried about what we've created." Cecilia had been folding laundry, dismissing William's concerns with practiced ease. "He's going through a rough patch. The divorce, the custody issues, the pressure at work. Once things settle down, Cecilia." William's voice had carried gentle firmness. "When has David ever not been going through a rough patch? When has there ever been a time when he didn't need our help to solve a crisis that somehow wasn't his fault?" The question had stung because it was unanswerable. From college onward, David's life had been a series of emergencies requiring parental intervention. Credit card debt threatening graduation. Business ventures failing due to allegedly dishonest partners. Investment opportunities that turned out to be scams. Always presented with the same pattern: David as victim, his parents as saviors. "He needs time to mature," she'd argued, but even then the words had felt hollow. "Does he?" William had asked quietly. "Or does he need to face consequences? Real ones? The kind that teach instead of enable?" She'd been angry then, hurt by what felt like criticism of her parenting. But now, with David's cruel words echoing in her mind, Cecilia could see the conversation differently. William hadn't been attacking David out of lack of love. He'd been trying to save their son from becoming exactly what he'd shown himself to be tonight. The memory shifted further back to David's childhood. He'd been charming, the kind of child who drew smiles from strangers. But underneath the charm lay something calculating, a precocious understanding of manipulation over effort. She remembered when David was 7, caught stealing money from her purse for school candy. When confronted, he'd constructed an elaborate story about needing money to buy a gift for a classmate whose mother was sick. The lie had been so detailed, so emotionally compelling, that even after discovering the truth, Cecilia had almost believed it. William had wanted serious consequences. But Cecilia had interceded, moved by David's tears and promises. They'd settled for a gentle lecture and an apology. The pattern had been established then. David would transgress, construct a sympathetic narrative, and rely on his mother's protective instincts to shield him from meaningful consequences. And Cecilia, driven by love and the need to believe in her child's goodness, had enabled the cycle for 35 years. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. Through the side window, she saw Sarah on the doorstep, still in hospital scrubs. "I'm so sorry to bother you this late," Sarah said when Cecilia opened the door. "I saw your light and wanted to make sure you were okay after earlier." The simple kindness, checking on a neighbor's well-being without being asked, sacrificing sleep after a long workday, struck Cecilia with unexpected force. When had someone last cared about her emotional state without wanting something in return? "I'm not fine," Cecilia admitted. "But I'm better than I was. Come in. You must be exhausted." They settled in the kitchen, the informal heart of the house. Sarah accepted tea gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Rough night at the hospital?" Cecilia asked. 3 back-to-back shifts this week. Mr. Jameson finally went home after hip surgery. Mrs. Rodriguez is recovering beautifully from her stroke, and we had a new admission, 18-year-old motorcycle accident. Touch and go for a while, but he'll be fine. The way Sarah spoke about her patients, with genuine concern and personal investment, reminded Cecilia of William's approach to their real estate clients. He'd never treated them as transactions, but as people with dreams and fears. "You care about them," Cecilia observed. "How could I not? I see them at their most vulnerable." "It's impossible not to care." "Tell me about Jake and Emma," Cecilia said. "How are they handling your long hours?" Sarah's face lit up with maternal pride. "They're incredible. Jake does most of the cooking now. He's better at it than I am. Emma helps him with math while he helps her with essays. They've created this whole household management system while I'm at work. Remarkable maturity for 16-year-olds. They've had to grow up fast. When their father left, when we moved here, When I took extra shifts, they adapted without complaint. Sometimes I worry I've asked too much. Cecilia thought about David's children, her grandchildren whom she saw infrequently. Bright kids, but already showing signs of their father's entitlement. The contrast with Jake and Emma was stark. Here were teenagers working together, accepting responsibility without resentment, dreaming big while understanding limitations. Jake wants to study engineering, Sarah continued. MIT is his dream, but the tuition. I've been saving what I can, but it won't be enough. He's already looking at state schools. Talking about working his way through. He never complains, never makes me feel guilty. That almost makes it worse. And Emma? Art school. Incredibly talented, but programs are expensive and career prospects uncertain. I want to support her dreams while encouraging practicality. It's difficult. You've raised remarkable children, Cecilia said. They've raised themselves, mostly. I just provide stability and encouragement. That's more than many parents manage, Cecilia replied, thinking of her own spectacular failure. After comfortable silence, Sarah asked, "Can I say something? You don't have to answer if it's too personal." Cecilia nodded. "Earlier, when your son was leaving, he seemed very angry. And you seemed hurt, but also somehow relieved. Like you'd finally seen something clearly." The observation was astute. Sarah had witnessed the moment when 35 years of willful blindness had cracked. "David told me I had nothing left to give," Cecilia said quietly. "He meant it as an indictment of my usefulness to him. But sitting here with you, watching how you care for your children and patients and even difficult neighbors, I'm wondering if he might have been accidentally right. I don't understand. Maybe I don't have anything left to give to him. Maybe I've given him everything he was capable of receiving, and continuing would just enable more of the same." Cecilia paused, surprised by her clarity. "But that doesn't mean I have nothing left to give at all. It means I need to be more thoughtful about where I direct my generosity." After Sarah left, Cecilia returned to William's desk and pulled out a legal pad. At the top she wrote, "What William would want me to do." The list was short but profound. Protect David from becoming worse. Stop enabling damaging behavior. Support people who will use resources wisely. Choose love over guilt, wisdom over emotion. Trust that real love sometimes requires difficult choices. For the first time since William's death, she felt connected to his values, rather than just his memory. David's cruel words had been intended to diminish her. Instead, they'd awakened her sense of agency, her ability to make choices reflecting her values rather than her fears. She thought about Jake's dreams of MIT, Emma's artistic ambitions, Sarah's tireless dedication. Here was a family embodying everything she and William had believed in: hard work, mutual support, gratitude, and understanding that achievement required effort. The idea forming in her mind was radical, unprecedented, legally complicated. But as she sat surrounded by the life she and William had built together, Cecilia Thompson began to smile. David had told her she had nothing left to give. Tomorrow, she would begin proving him spectacularly wrong. The autumn morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of October day that had always made Cecilia feel hopeful about possibilities. She'd managed 3 hours of sleep before waking with unusual clarity, her mind already focused on the conversation she needed to have with Patricia Wells. But first, she wanted to observe Sarah in her natural environment, to confirm what her heart already knew. From her kitchen window, Cecilia watched the Mitchell family's morning routine unfold like a carefully choreographed dance. Sarah emerged from the house at exactly 6:15, lunch bag in hand, pausing to wave at Jake, who was visible through their kitchen window washing dishes. Emma appeared on the front step, school backpack slung over one shoulder, an artist's portfolio case in the other hand. "Don't forget your calculus quiz," Sarah called out, though her voice carried more encouragement than worry. "Already reviewed it twice," Jake replied, appearing in the doorway. "Emma, you have your portfolio review after school, right?" 3 o'clock with Mrs. Patterson. And yes, I have all my best pieces. Emma's voice carried excitement rather than anxiety. She said the scholarship committee will review applications next month. Cecilia found herself leaning closer to the window, drawn by the easy communication between them. No demands, no manipulation, no guilt, just three people supporting each other's goals with genuine affection. "I'll be home by 4, Sarah said, checking her watch. "We can celebrate Jake's quiz results and talk through Emma's portfolio feedback over dinner." "I'm making that chicken recipe Mr. Henderson gave us," Jake announced. "The one with the herbs from Mrs. Thompson's garden." Quote, Cecilia smiled, remembering the afternoon she'd sent the twins home with basil and rosemary from her greenhouse. They'd been helping her weed the flower beds, not because she'd asked, but because Emma had noticed her struggling with her arthritic hands and had simply started pulling weeds while chatting about her latest art project. As the family separated for their respective days, Cecilia noticed something that made her chest tighten with recognition. Sarah had declined Jake's offer to pack her lunch the night before, insisting she could handle it herself. But this morning, Cecilia could see that her lunch bag appeared fuller than usual. The twins had clearly added something, probably Jake's homemade cookies or one of Emma's encouraging notes, without being asked and without expecting acknowledgement. The contrast with her own family dynamics was profound. When had David ever done something thoughtful for her without being asked? When had he ever noticed her needs and quietly addressed them? Even as a child, his gestures had always been performative, designed to earn praise or avoid consequences rather than express genuine care. At 9 a.m. sharp, Cecilia dialed Patricia Wells's office. Her lawyer's assistant, Monica, recognized her voice immediately. "Mrs. Thompson, how lovely to hear from you. Mrs. Wells has an opening at 11, if you'd like to come in." "Actually, I was hoping she might have time for a hypothetical question over the phone," Cecilia said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Something I'd like to explore before deciding whether it requires a formal appointment." "Of course. Let me transfer you." Patricia's voice carried the warmth of 30 years of friendship mixed with professional concern. "Cecilia, how are you holding up? I know yesterday was difficult." Word traveled fast in Millbrook Heights, especially among the professional community. Patricia had likely heard about David's dramatic exit from multiple sources by now. "I'm clearer than I've been in months," Cecilia replied honestly. "Which brings me to my question. Hypothetically speaking, what would be involved in changing the beneficiary of David's trust fund?" The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Cecilia wondered if the call had dropped. "Cecilia," Patricia said finally, her voice carefully measured, "you're talking about a $400,000 trust that's been established for 3 years. The legal mechanisms exist to make changes, but the implications, what kind of implications? Personal, familial, potentially legal if David chose to challenge your mental competency. This isn't a decision to make lightly, especially not in the immediate aftermath of an emotional confrontation." Cecilia had expected this response. Patricia was nothing if not thorough in considering all angles. "What if the confrontation simply clarified something I'd been avoiding for years? Then we'd need to document your reasoning very carefully. Courts take a dim view of inheritance changes that appear vindictive or made under emotional duress. And if the reasoning was sound? If it reflected a genuine assessment of the beneficiary's character and the likely use of the funds?" Patricia's professional training warred with her personal concern. "Cecilia, I need to ask directly. Are you considering removing David as beneficiary of his trust?" "I'm considering transferring it to someone who would use it to build rather than simply consume." "Who?" Cecilia took a deep breath, knowing that once she spoke the words aloud, there would be no taking them back. "Sarah Mitchell, my neighbor." The silence was even longer this time. When Patricia spoke, her voice carried a mixture of shock and professional alarm. "Cecilia, you've known this woman for, 5 years? You're talking about giving her nearly $500,000. The legal challenges alone. Would you have time to see me this afternoon?" Cecilia interrupted gently. "I think this conversation needs to happen in person. I can clear my schedule. But Cecilia, I'm obligated to advise you that major financial decisions made during periods of grief and family conflict often reflect clearer thinking than decisions made during periods of enabling and denial, Cecilia finished. I'll see you at 2 o'clock. After hanging up, Cecilia sat in William's chair and forced herself to examine her motivations with brutal honesty. Was this revenge against David's cruelty? Was it grief-driven irrationality? Or was it the first clear-headed decision she'd made regarding her son in decades? The answer came as she watched Sarah's car pull into the Mitchell driveway at noon, her lunch break from the hospital. Instead of resting, Sarah was using her 30 minutes to check on something at home. Through the window, Cecilia could see her neighbor emerge with a basket of laundry, hanging clothes on the line with efficient movements while talking on the phone. Probably coordinating schedules with Jake and Emma, ensuring everyone's needs were covered despite her exhausting schedule. David would have used those 30 minutes to complain about his circumstances or demand solutions from someone else. Sarah used them to solve problems quietly and effectively. At 1:45, Cecilia arrived at Patricia's law office, a restored Victorian mansion in Millbrook Heights Historic District. The building radiated the kind of understated prosperity that characterized the best of the community. Successful but not ostentatious, traditional but not stodgy. Patricia's office occupied the entire second floor, with windows overlooking the town square where families gathered on weekend afternoons. The space reflected its occupant. Elegant but practical, with legal texts sharing shelf space with family photos and community awards. "You look." Patricia paused, studying Cecilia's face with the attention of someone trained to read subtle cues. "Different. More focused than I've seen you since William's funeral." "I feel different," Cecilia admitted, settling into the familiar chair across from Patricia's desk. "Like I've been wearing glasses with the wrong prescription and finally put on the right pair." Patricia opened a legal pad and positioned her pen with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for a complex discussion. "Walk me through your reasoning." "All of it, starting with yesterday's confrontation with David." For the next hour, Cecilia laid out her case with a thoroughness that surprised them both. She described David's escalating financial demands, his emotional manipulation, his complete disregard for her well-being, unless it served his needs. She contrasted this with Sarah's consistent kindness, her children's remarkable character, their family's approach to challenges and opportunities. The trust was intended to help David build a stable future, Cecilia concluded, but giving it to him now would just enable more of the same destructive patterns. He'd use it to avoid consequences rather than create something meaningful. Patricia had been taking notes throughout, her expression shifting from concern to thoughtful consideration. "You've clearly given this extensive thought, but I need to ask, what happens if David contests this decision? He could claim undue influence from the Mitchell family, or argue that your grief has impaired your judgment." "Then we'll prove otherwise," Cecilia said with quiet confidence. "I'm willing to undergo any mental competency evaluation required. I'm willing to document my reasoning in excruciating detail. This isn't impulse, Patricia. This is the most rational decision I've made in years. And you've considered how this will affect your relationship with David permanently?" Cecilia thought of her son's parting words, the cold calculation in his eyes as he dismissed her worth. What relationship? The one where I exist solely to solve his problems, where my value is measured entirely by my usefulness to him. If that's the only relationship he's capable of having with me, then it's already over. Patricia set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "The legal mechanics are straightforward. We'd need to revoke the existing trust document and create a new one with Sarah Mitchell as beneficiary. But Cecilia, once we start this process, there's no going back quietly. David will know, probably within days. I understand. Do you? Because he won't just accept this. He'll fight it with everything he has. Legally, emotionally, socially. He'll try to turn the community against you, claim you're being manipulated, or that you've lost your mental faculties. Are you prepared for that kind of battle?" Cecilia thought about William's values written on her legal pad, about Jake's quiet dreams and Emma's artistic ambitions, about Sarah's midnight check on a lonely neighbor after 3 back-to-back shifts. "I've been avoiding a battle for 35 years, she said finally. "It's time I stopped running from one and started fighting for something that matters." Patricia studied her friend's face for a long moment, then pulled out a fresh legal pad. "In that case, let's make sure we do this right. Tell me everything you know about Sarah Mitchell's character, her family's circumstances, and why you believe this trust would be used responsibly." As Cecilia began to speak, about midnight soup deliveries and calculus homework, about teenagers who cooked dinner and supported each other's dreams, about a mother who worked 2 jobs and still found energy to care for others, she felt something she hadn't experienced since William's death: the satisfaction of making a choice that honored both love and wisdom. Outside Patricia's window, the October afternoon was fading into evening. Soon the Mitchell family would gather around their dinner table, sharing the day's victories and challenges with genuine interest in each other's lives. Soon, David would return to his expensive condo and his mounting debts, wondering how to extract more money from a mother he saw only as a resource. But tonight, for the first time in months, Cecilia Thompson would sleep peacefully, knowing she was finally giving her most precious gift, William's legacy, to someone who would treasure it rather than simply spend it. The revolution had begun with her son's cruel words. Tomorrow it would continue with the most radical act of love she'd ever attempted. The documents were signed by Thursday afternoon. Patricia had worked with unusual speed, perhaps sensing that Cecilia's resolve would only strengthen with time rather than weaken. The new trust papers sat in a manila envelope on Cecilia's kitchen counter, their legal weight somehow both insignificant and momentous. $400,000, redirected from entitlement to opportunity with a few signatures and notary stamps. Now came the harder part, telling Sarah. Cecilia had rehearsed various approaches during her sleepless Wednesday night. Casual mentions over tea, formal presentations with documentation, emotional appeals about family and legacy. None felt right. How did you tell someone their life was about to change completely? How did you offer a gift so large it might feel more like a burden than a blessing? The opportunity came Friday evening, when she noticed Sarah's car in the driveway earlier than usual. Through her window, Cecilia could see lights on in the Mitchell kitchen and the familiar silhouettes of family dinner, Jake setting the table while Emma helped Sarah at the stove. The scene pulled at something deep in her chest, a longing for the kind of easy togetherness she'd taken for granted during her own family's better days. At 7 o'clock, Cecilia walked across the perfectly manicured lawn that separated their properties, the manila envelope clutched in hands that trembled slightly despite her conviction. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of children playing in other yards. Normal evening sounds in a normal neighborhood, about to be disrupted by an entirely abnormal conversation. Sarah answered the door wearing an apron dusted with flour, her face flushed from cooking. "Mrs. Thompson! What a lovely surprise! We were just finishing dinner. Would you like to join us for dessert?" Emma made apple crisp. "Actually," Cecilia said, her carefully rehearsed words suddenly inadequate, "I was hoping we could talk privately. It's important." Something in Cecilia's tone made Sarah's expression shift from welcoming to concerned. "Of course. Let me just… Jake, Emma, can you handle cleanup? Mrs. Thompson and I need to chat." They settled in Sarah's living room, a space that managed to feel both lived in and cared for, despite its obvious budget constraints. The furniture was mismatched but comfortable, the walls decorated with Emma's artwork and Jake's academic certificates. Everything spoke of a family that valued substance over appearance, achievement over acquisition. "You look like someone with something serious on your mind," Sarah said, settling into her chair with the careful attention of someone prepared to listen. "I've made a decision," Cecilia began, then stopped, realizing how inadequate the words were. "About David's inheritance. About what William would have wanted. About what feels right." Sarah's expression grew more concerned. "I hope our conversation the other night didn't influence any family decisions. I would never want to come between." "You didn't come between anything," Cecilia interrupted gently. "You showed me something I needed to see." The difference between earned and unearned loyalty. Between people who give and people who take. She reached for the manila envelope, her hands steadier now that the moment had arrived. "Sarah, I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible." "Okay," Sarah said slowly, her voice carrying the wariness of someone who'd learned that impossible news was rarely good news. David was supposed to inherit a trust fund when he turns 45. $400,000 that William and I saved and invested over the years. Cecilia paused, watching Sarah's face for any sign of calculation or greed. She saw only polite interest. "I've changed the beneficiary. I don't understand. I've transferred the trust to you, to your family." The words came out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly might make them easier to absorb. "The money is yours now." Sarah went very still, not frozen with shock, but still in the way of someone whose mind was working too quickly for their body to keep up. Her eyes darted to the envelope in Cecilia's hands, then back to her face, searching for signs of jest or delusion. "That's not—" Sarah began, then stopped. $400,000? "Yes, you're giving it to us?" "Yes." Sarah stood abruptly, then sat back down, then stood again. Her hands fluttered to her hair, to her apron, as if she needed to ground herself in physical reality. "Mrs. Thompson, I can't. We can't accept that. It's too much." "It's David's money." "It was David's money," Cecilia corrected. "Now it's yours. Legally, completely, irrevocably yours." "But why?" The question came out as almost a whisper. "We barely know each other. We're neighbors, not family." "Aren't we?" Cecilia asked quietly. "In the ways that matter most?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears she was clearly trying not to shed. "I don't understand what we did to deserve this." "You existed," Cecilia said simply. "You worked 2 jobs without complaint. You raised children who think of others before themselves. You brought soup to a lonely woman and asked for nothing in return. You showed me what it looks like when people give out of love rather than obligation." "Mrs. Thompson, Cecilia, this is incredibly generous, but I can't take money from your son. What about David? What about your relationship with him?" The directness of the question surprised Cecilia with its relief. Here was someone worried about consequences to others, rather than calculating personal benefit. "David told me I had nothing left to give," Cecilia said. "He was wrong. I had this, one last chance to honor William's values and support people who will use this gift to build something meaningful." Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she struggled to process the magnitude of what was happening. This will change everything. Jake's college dreams, Emma's art school, our entire future. That's the idea. From the kitchen came the sound of dishes being washed and teenage voices discussing homework plans. Normal sounds of a family functioning together, unaware that their world was shifting beneath their feet. "I need to tell them," Sarah said suddenly. "Jake and Emma, they need to know. But I don't know how to explain." She looked at Cecilia helplessly. "How do you tell your children that a neighbor just changed their entire lives?" "Carefully," Cecilia suggested. "Honestly, the same way you've handled every other challenge. Together." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with her apron. "Will you stay while I tell them? I think they should hear this from you too." The request touched Cecilia more deeply than she'd expected. Sarah wanted to share this moment, to include her in the family discussion, rather than handle it privately. It was exactly the kind of generous impulse that had convinced Cecilia she was making the right choice. "If you're sure that's what you want." "Mom?" Emma's voice called from the kitchen. "Is everything okay? You sound upset." Sarah looked at Cecilia, who nodded encouragingly. "Jake, Emma, can you come in here, please? Mrs. Thompson has something to tell us." As the twins entered the living room, Jake wiping his hands on a dish towel, Emma's face creased with concern. Cecilia felt a moment of profound clarity. This was what family looked like when it worked properly. People who cared about each other's well-being, who faced challenges together, who celebrated victories as shared achievements. "Sit down," Sarah said gently. "Both of you. What Mrs. Thompson is about to tell you is going to sound impossible." Cecilia looked at these three remarkable people: a mother who worked herself to exhaustion for her children's dreams, teenagers who supported their family without resentment, and knew that William would approve of this decision completely. "It might sound impossible," she said, settling back in her chair with the manila envelope in her lap, "but sometimes the most impossible things are also the most right." The twins' reactions had been everything Cecilia could have hoped for. Jake's quiet tears of gratitude, Emma's stunned whispers about art school possibilities, both of them immediately asking what this meant for their mother's exhausting work schedule. Not a trace of entitlement or expectation, just overwhelming appreciation and concern for each other's well-being. That had been Friday evening. By Monday morning, the secret felt like a living thing in Cecilia's chest, growing stronger with each passing hour. She'd expected to feel nervous about David's inevitable discovery. Instead, she felt oddly peaceful, as if she'd finally aligned her actions with her values after years of moral compromise. The explosion came Tuesday afternoon. Cecilia was in her greenhouse, repotting orchids that had outgrown their containers, when she heard David's BMW roar into the driveway with unnecessary force. Through the glass walls, she could see him storming toward the front door, his face mottled with rage even from a distance. His expensive suit looked rumpled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. She made her way to the house slowly, taking time to remove her gardening gloves and wash her hands. If this was to be their final confrontation, she wanted to meet it with dignity rather than haste. David was already inside, having used his key without knocking. He stood in the foyer like an avenging angel, his chest heaving with barely controlled fury. "What the hell have you done?" he shouted, before she'd even fully entered the room. "Hello, David," Cecilia said calmly, hanging her gardening apron on its hook by the door. "I assume Patricia's office called you." "Called me?" His voice cracked on the words. "They called to inform me that my inheritance has been transferred to some random neighbor? $400,000 given away to people we barely know? I know them quite well, actually. Better than I've known you for years. ... The comment hit him like a physical blow. His face flushed deeper, and for a moment Cecilia thought he might actually strike her. Instead, he began pacing the foyer with manic energy. "This is insane. You're having some kind of breakdown, grief-induced dementia or something. No rational person gives away $400,000 to strangers." "They're not strangers, David. They're the family that's been caring for me while you've been treating me like a bank account with legs." "Caring for you?" He whirled to face her, his expression incredulous. "What could they possibly provide that I haven't? I check on you. I call. When you need money. That's not." He stopped, realizing the truth of the statement. "I'm your son. They're nobodies who somehow convinced a grieving old woman to sign away her family's legacy." Cecilia felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. "Is that what you think happened? That I was manipulated?" What else could it be? Sarah Mitchell works as a hospital janitor, for Christ's sake. Her kids are scholarship students at the public school. They saw an opportunity and took advantage of a lonely widow. The characterization was so wrong, so fundamentally opposite to everything Cecilia had observed, that it clarified her decision more completely than any legal document could have. "Sarah Mitchell," she said quietly, "has never asked me for anything. Not once. She brings soup when I'm lonely, helps with my garden when my arthritis flares, includes me in her family's celebrations without expecting anything in return. Her children treat me with genuine affection, not because they hope to inherit something, but because they were raised to care about other people's well-being." "Oh, spare me the saint act," David snarled. "Everyone wants something. She just played the long game better than most. The way you've been playing it for 42 years? The question hung in the air between them like smoke. David's pacing stopped abruptly, his face cycling through expressions of shock, rage, and something that might have been recognition. "I'm your son," he said finally, as if that explained everything. "Yes," Cecilia agreed, "you are. And I've spent your entire adult life enabling your worst impulses, because I confused unconditional love, with unconditional funding. This is about Friday night, isn't it? About what I said. I was upset, under pressure. You were honest, Cecilia interrupted. For the first time in years, you told me exactly what you think of me. That I have nothing left to give. That my only value is financial. That I should liquidate my life to solve your problems. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I didn't mean. Yes, you did, and you were right in a way. I don't have anything left to give you, because everything I've given you over the years has made you worse, not better. Every crisis I've solved for you has prevented you from developing the character to solve your own problems. So you're punishing me? His voice rose to a pitch that would have embarrassed him in any other circumstance. Giving my inheritance to strangers as some kind of lesson? I'm protecting you, Cecilia said, surprised by the gentleness in her own voice. From becoming an even worse version of yourself than you already are. The words seemed to deflate him slightly. For a moment, she glimpsed the little boy he'd once been, before charm and manipulation had become his primary tools for navigating the world. Mom, he said, and his voice cracked on the word. I'm in real trouble here. The business is failing, the divorce settlement is crushing me, and I'm about to lose everything. I need that money. You've needed money before. You'll need it again. Giving you $400,000 won't solve the fundamental problem. What fundamental problem? That you've never learned to live within your means. That you see other people as resources to be exploited rather than relationships to be nurtured. That you believe the world owes you something it doesn't. David stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. So what am I supposed to do? Just accept that my own mother has chosen strangers over her own son? You're supposed to figure it out, Cecilia said firmly. The way Jake Mitchell is figuring out how to pay for college. The way Sarah figured out how to rebuild her life after her divorce. The way millions of people figure out how to solve their problems without expecting someone else to write a check. Jake Mitchell is 16 years old, and already more mature than you are at 42. The truth of the statement seemed to hit David with physical force. He stumbled backward, his face cycling through rage, disbelief, and something that might have been the first glimmer of self-awareness he'd experienced in years. I won't let this stand, he said finally, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I'll contest it. Mental incompetency, undue influence, whatever it takes. Those people will never see a penny of Dad's money. Your father's money was never intended for you to waste, Cecilia replied. It was meant to help you build something meaningful. Since you've proven incapable of that, it's going to people who will honor its purpose. We'll see about that. David straightened his suit jacket with sharp, angry movements. I've already contacted a lawyer. A good one, who specializes in cases exactly like this. Elder abuse, financial manipulation, family members taking advantage of grief-stricken relatives. Then you'll discover that I underwent a complete mental competency evaluation before making this decision, that I documented my reasoning extensively, that no one from the Mitchell family has ever asked me for anything, including this inheritance. David's face went pale. You planned this. You actually planned to destroy your own son. I planned to honor your father's values instead of enabling your worst impulses. There's a difference. The front door opened, and Sarah Mitchell stepped inside, her face flushed from hurrying across the lawn. She must have seen David's car and sensed trouble. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said breathlessly, but I heard shouting and wanted to make sure everything was okay. David turned to face her with a look of pure hatred. This is all your fault. Manipulating a grieving old woman, playing the poor single mother card, getting your claws into money that doesn't belong to you. Sarah's expression shifted from concern to confusion. I don't understand. Don't you? David stepped closer to her, his voice rising again. Poor little Sarah, struggling to make ends meet, needing help with her precious children's education. How long have you been planning this? How many sob stories did you feed my mother before she cracked? David, stop, Cecilia said sharply, but her son was beyond hearing. Did you tell her about Jake's college dreams? Emma's art school fantasies? Did you cry about how hard it is to work 2 jobs? Whatever sob story you used, it worked. Congratulations on the biggest con of your pathetic life. Sarah's face had gone very still, the way it did when she was processing something difficult. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet dignity that made David's ranting seem even more ugly by comparison. I have no idea what you're talking about, she said simply. But I think you should leave. I'm not going anywhere until… Yes, said a new voice from the doorway. You are. Frank Henderson stepped into the foyer, his presence immediately changing the dynamics of the room. At 73, he still carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. Frank, Cecilia said, relief evident in her voice. I didn't know you were coming by. Heard the shouting from my driveway, Frank replied, his eyes never leaving David's face. Thought you might need some support. David looked between the three of them. His mother, the neighbor he was convinced had manipulated her, and the family friend who'd watched him grow up and seemed to realize for the first time that he was alone in his outrage. This isn't over, he said, backing toward the door. I'll fight this with everything I have. And when I win, when I prove what really happened here, you'll all see exactly what kind of people you're dealing with. He slammed the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed, Cecilia could hear her heartbeat and the distant sound of his BMW tearing out of the driveway. Are you all right? Sarah asked softly. Cecilia looked at this woman who'd rushed over to check on her well-being, who'd endured David's verbal assault with grace, who'd never once asked what she might have done to deserve such hatred. Then she looked at Frank, whose loyalty had brought him running at the first sign of trouble. Yes, she said, surprised by how true it felt. For the first time in years, I think I really am. The news spread through Millbrook Heights with the efficiency of a well-oiled gossip network. By Thursday morning, Cecilia's decision had become the primary topic of conversation at the country club, the grocery store, and every coffee shop in town. The reactions fell predictably along established lines. Those who knew Sarah's character supported Cecilia's choice, while those who valued traditional family hierarchy were scandalized. Cecilia learned about the community's response through Frank Henderson, who arrived Friday morning with coffee and a grim expression. David's been busy, he said without preamble, settling into William's chair as if prepared for a lengthy briefing. He spent yesterday at the club, telling anyone who'd listen that you're suffering from dementia and being manipulated by predatory neighbors. And people believed him? Some did. The Weatherbys are convinced you've lost your mind. Margaret Sinclair thinks Sarah Mitchell is running some kind of long-term con. But others. Frank smiled slightly. Others remember watching Sarah shovel your driveway last winter while David was in Cabo with his girlfriend. The reminder of David's absence during her bout with pneumonia still stung. Sarah had appeared at her door with soup and medicine, staying to check her fever while David had posted beach photos on social media. He's hired Richard Blackwood, Frank continued, his expression growing more serious. Expensive lawyer from downtown. Specializes in elder law and competency challenges. Cecilia recognized the name. Blackwood had represented several wealthy families in contested inheritance cases. His reputation was built on aggressive tactics and media manipulation. Patricia warned me this would happen, she said. Are you having second thoughts about supporting my decision? Frank leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. Cecilia, I watched that boy grow up. I watched you and William bend over backward to give him every advantage, every opportunity. And I watched him waste it all while expecting more. What you did took courage. The kind William would have been proud of. The validation meant more than Cecilia had expected. Frank had been William's closest friend and business partner, the one person who'd witnessed their family dynamics without the filters of politeness or distance. There's something else, Frank said carefully. Jennifer wants to see you. David's ex-wife. She called this morning, said she has information that might be helpful. The prospect of seeing Jennifer again brought mixed emotions. Cecilia had always liked her former daughter-in-law, but their relationship had become awkward after the divorce. Jennifer had been careful not to criticize David directly, but her relief at escaping the marriage had been obvious. What kind of information? She wouldn't say over the phone, but she sounded determined. like someone who'd made a difficult decision about what side of this fight she wants to be on. An hour later, Jennifer Thompson sat in Cecilia's living room, looking more confident than she had during her marriage to David. 3 years of independence had strengthened her, erased the anxious edge that had characterized her final years as David's wife. "I heard about the inheritance," Jennifer said without preamble. "David called me Tuesday night, ranting about family betrayal and legal action. He wanted me to testify about your mental state, claim you'd been acting strangely since William's death." "And?" Jennifer's smile was sharp. "I told him I'd be happy to testify about your mental state, about family dynamics, about patterns of behavior I observed during our marriage." The implication was clear. Jennifer's testimony would not support David's narrative. "He doesn't understand what you're offering, does he?" Cecilia asked. "David has never understood the difference between people who support him and people who fear him. During our marriage, I went along with his version of events because it was easier than fighting. But I'm not married to him anymore." Jennifer reached into her purse and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "Financial records from our marriage. Credit card statements, loan applications, bank records showing the pattern of bailouts from you and William. David's lawyer will try to paint this inheritance change as sudden and irrational. These documents show it's the logical conclusion of 30 years of escalating financial irresponsibility." The evidence was damning. Page after page of overspending, failed investments, and emergency requests to his parents. Even during the periods when David's career was supposedly thriving, he'd been living beyond his means and expecting family money to cover the difference. "Why are you showing me this?" Cecilia asked. "Because you gave me something David never could," Jennifer replied. "You treated me like family even when your son didn't. You supported me during the divorce, helped with the children's expenses, never made me feel like I was taking sides in some family war. You showed me what real love looks like, love that doesn't come with conditions or expectations." The confession brought tears to Cecilia's eyes. She'd helped Jennifer financially during the divorce proceedings, but she'd done it quietly, without telling David or expecting gratitude. It had simply felt like the right thing to do. "There's more," Jennifer continued. "David's been calling the children, trying to turn them against you, telling Marcus and Sophie that their grandmother chose strangers over her own family, that the money they might have inherited someday is gone because of your selfishness." The manipulation of her grandchildren hit Cecilia like a physical blow. Are they believing him? Marcus is confused. He's only 12 and he doesn't understand the complexities. But Sophie... Jennifer's expression softened. "Sophie asked me if it was true that you gave money to a family with teenagers who worked jobs to help their mother. When I confirmed it, she said that sounded exactly like something Grandma Cecilia would do." The wisdom of a 10-year-old child cut through weeks of adult complexity with startling clarity. Sophie had understood something that David, at 42, remained incapable of grasping. "I want to help," Jennifer said firmly, "however I can. Testimony, documentation, whatever Patricia needs to prove that you made this decision with complete mental clarity and for excellent reasons." Meanwhile, across town, Pastor James Morrison was having his own challenging conversation. Sarah Mitchell sat in his office, her face drawn with stress and sleepless nights. "I keep thinking I should give it back," Sarah said quietly. "The money. This fight that's tearing apart Mrs. Thompson's family, it's because of me." "Is it?" Pastor Morrison asked gently. "Or is it because a family that was already broken is finally being forced to acknowledge the damage?" "David thinks I manipulated her. Half the town probably thinks the same thing. Maybe they're right. Maybe I unconsciously did something." "Sarah." The pastor's voice carried the authority of someone who'd counseled families through decades of crises. "I've watched your family for 5 years. I've seen how you treat your children, your neighbors, your community. If you were capable of the kind of calculated manipulation David is describing, you would have used those skills to improve your own situation long before now. But $400,000. is exactly what someone like Cecilia Thompson would give to a family like yours, if she had the wisdom to see past blood relationships to actual character. The question isn't whether you deserve this gift. The question is what you'll do with the opportunity it represents. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the pastor's words. Jake wants to use his portion to pay for college and then help fund Emma's art education. Emma wants to invest in your scholarship program for underprivileged kids. They're both worried about me working so hard, want me to cut back my hours so I can focus on the catering business. And what do you want? I want to prove that Mrs. Thompson's faith in us was justified. I want David to be wrong about who we are and what we're capable of becoming. Pastor Morrison smiled. Then stop feeling guilty about receiving grace and start thinking about how to honor it. That evening, as Cecilia prepared for bed, she reflected on the day's conversations. Jennifer's support, Frank's loyalty, even the reports of community division, all of it confirmed that she'd made the right choice for the right reasons. David could hire expensive lawyers and spread rumors about her mental state. He could try to turn her grandchildren against her and divide the community with his accusations. But he couldn't change the fundamental truth that had driven her decision. Some people build with what they're given, while others simply consume it. The Mitchell family would build. David would have consumed. The war was far from over, but tonight, Cecilia Thompson slept peacefully, knowing she was fighting on the right side. The courthouse steps felt slippery beneath Cecilia's feet as she climbed toward the imposing limestone facade, though the October morning was crisp and dry. Patricia Wells walked beside her, briefcase in hand, radiating the calm confidence of someone thoroughly prepared for battle. Behind them, Frank Henderson provided steady support, his presence both protective and reassuring. "Remember," Patricia murmured as they approached the entrance, "Blackwood will try to rattle you. He'll paint you as a confused widow manipulated by scheming neighbors. Stay calm, answer only what's asked, and trust that the evidence speaks for itself." Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than Cecilia had expected, though perhaps that was because it was filled with familiar faces. David sat at the plaintiff's table beside Richard Blackwood, a silver-haired man whose expensive suit and calculating expression marked him as exactly the kind of lawyer who specialized in turning families against each other for profit. Sarah Mitchell sat in the gallery's front row, flanked by Jake and Emma. All three looked uncomfortable in their formal clothes. Sarah in a borrowed dress that was slightly too large, the twins in their church outfits that suddenly seemed inadequate for such momentous proceedings. Their presence steadied Cecilia more than any legal preparation could have. "Your Honor," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "We are here today because a vulnerable elderly woman has been manipulated into making an irrational financial decision that betrays her deceased husband's wishes and devastates her only child." Judge Margaret Hartwell, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes, listened without expression. Cecilia had learned that Hartwell had a reputation for thorough preparation and impatience with grandstanding, qualities that might work in their favor. The defendant, Mrs. Cecilia Thompson, is a 77-year-old widow. 67, Patricia corrected quietly, who recently suffered the devastating loss of her husband of 37 years. In her grief and isolation, she became susceptible to the calculated kindness of neighbors who identified her as a target for financial exploitation. Cecilia felt a flash of anger at the characterization, but kept her expression neutral. Beside her, Patricia made notes with the methodical precision of someone building a counter-argument. "The evidence will show," Blackwood continued, "that Sarah Mitchell, a hospital custodian with significant financial pressures, systematically cultivated a relationship with Mrs. Thompson for the express purpose of gaining access to family wealth. Through a campaign of manipulation disguised as neighborly concern, she convinced a grieving woman to transfer $400,000 away from its rightful beneficiary, Mrs. Thompson's own son." David nodded along with his lawyer's presentation, his expression a careful mask of wounded innocence. But Cecilia could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the table's edge. He was nervous, she realized. For all his bluster and threats, he wasn't certain of victory. "Your Honor," Patricia rose gracefully, her voice carrying quiet authority. "What Mr. Blackwood describes as manipulation, we call character. What he terms exploitation, we call genuine friendship. Mrs. Thompson didn't transfer this inheritance because she was confused or coerced. She transferred it because she finally recognized the difference between people who give and people who take. The psychological evaluation had been thorough and, ultimately, vindicated Cecilia completely. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a neuropsychologist with impeccable credentials, testified that Cecilia showed no signs of cognitive impairment, dementia, or diminished capacity. Mrs. Thompson's mental acuity is well above average for her age group, Dr. Chen stated from the witness stand. Her reasoning abilities, memory function, and decision-making capacity all fall within normal ranges. She demonstrated clear understanding of the financial and familial implications of her choice. Blackwood's cross-examination was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective. Dr. Chen had evaluated hundreds of elderly clients and could distinguish between grief-related decision-making and impaired judgment. "Grief doesn't diminish cognitive capacity," she explained patiently. "It often clarifies priorities. Mrs. Thompson's decision reflects emotional growth, not mental decline." The afternoon brought character witnesses. Frank Henderson testified about David's pattern of financial dependence, documenting decades of bailouts and broken promises. His testimony was devastating in its quiet detail, not vindictive, but factual in a way that painted an undeniable picture. "David always had explanations," Frank said. "Bad partners, market downturns, unexpected expenses. But the pattern was consistent. Crisis, family bailout, temporary gratitude, then repetition." William grew concerned that their help was enabling rather than supporting their son's development. Jennifer's testimony was equally damaging to David's case. The financial records she provided showed systematic overspending and reliance on parental support throughout their marriage. "Mrs. Thompson continued helping me financially even after my divorce from her son," Jennifer testified. "She never asked for anything in return, never made me feel obligated. Her generosity was unconditional, the opposite of manipulation." Sarah's testimony was brief but powerful. Blackwood tried to paint her as a calculating opportunist, but her responses were too genuine, too unrehearsed to be manufactured. "I never asked Mrs. Thompson for money," Sarah said simply. "I never mentioned our financial struggles or my children's college dreams. She offered help occasionally, which I usually declined. The inheritance was a complete surprise." "But you accepted it," Blackwood pressed. "Eventually. After Mrs. Thompson explained that it was important to her to support people who would use the opportunity wisely." "And you consider yourself wise?" Sarah's small smile was devastating in its honesty. "I consider myself grateful and determined to prove her faith in us was justified." The twins' letter to the court, read aloud by Patricia, brought visible emotion to several jurors. Jake and Emma had written about their mother's sacrifices, their own dreams, and their determination to honor both the gift and the giver. "Mrs. Thompson didn't just give us money," Emma had written. "She gave us hope that good people still exist in the world, people who believe in investing in others' potential rather than enabling their weaknesses." As the day concluded, Cecilia felt cautiously optimistic. The evidence was clear, the testimony consistent, and David's case increasingly desperate. But she knew Blackwood would save his most aggressive tactics for tomorrow, when she would take the stand and face cross-examination designed to break her resolve. That evening, alone in the house that had become both sanctuary and battlefield, Cecilia reviewed Patricia's preparation notes. Tomorrow would determine not just the inheritance's fate, but whether her transformation from enabling mother to empowered woman would be legally recognized. Outside, lights glowed in the Mitchell house, where a family was learning that dreams could become reality when someone believed in their potential. Inside her own home, Cecilia Thompson prepared to defend the most important decision of her life. Cecilia's cross-examination was scheduled for 9 a.m., but the morning brought an unexpected development. Patricia arrived at the courthouse with a small group of people Cecilia recognized from around Millbrook Heights: shopkeepers, teachers, members of Sarah's church congregation. "They asked to testify," Patricia explained, her voice carrying barely contained excitement. character witnesses for the Mitchell family. Word spread about what's happening here, and people wanted the court to know what kind of people Sarah and her children really are. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, the elderly librarian who'd worked with Emma on her art scholarship applications, took the stand first. Her testimony was brief but powerful. Emma Mitchell volunteers at our children's reading program every Saturday, she said, her voice clear despite her 82 years. She creates artwork for our bulletin boards, helps shy children feel comfortable, never asks for community service credit or recognition. When I offered to pay her for her time, she asked if I could donate the money to buy more books instead. Margaret Foster, who owned the local deli where Jake worked weekend shifts, followed with similar testimony. Jake could work anywhere. He's bright, responsible, always on time, but he chose our small business because we needed help and couldn't afford to pay much. When we had a slow month and couldn't make payroll, he offered to work for free rather than leave us short-staffed. That's not the behavior of someone raised by a manipulative opportunist. Even David's children, through a carefully worded statement read by their school counselor, provided unexpected support for Cecilia's decision. Marcus and Sophie had been interviewed about their grandmother's character, and their responses undermined David's claims about family betrayal. Grandma Cecilia always remembers what we're interested in, Marcus had said. She asks about my baseball games and Sophie's dance recitals. She never just gives us money. She talks to us like we're real people. Sophie's comment was even more damaging to David's case. Daddy says Grandma chose strangers over family, but the Mitchell kids aren't strangers. Jake helped me with my science project when Daddy was too busy, and Emma taught me how to draw horses. Maybe Grandma thinks they're more like family than Daddy is. The children's honest observations, delivered without malice but with devastating clarity, visibly shook David. Cecilia watched her son's face cycle through emotions, as he realized that even his own children understood something he'd failed to grasp. But the morning's most significant surprise came when Judge Hartwell called an unexpected recess. During the break, Patricia pulled Cecilia aside with barely contained excitement. "Blackwood made a tactical error," she whispered. He subpoenaed David's current financial records to prove his need for the inheritance. But those same records show something else, evidence that might change everything. The records revealed that David had been systematically lying about his financial situation, while claiming desperate circumstances to justify his need for the inheritance. He'd actually been making substantial payments on a luxury vacation home in the Hamptons and maintaining expensive country club memberships. His crisis was largely manufactured to create pressure for early access to the trust. "He's been living a double life," Patricia explained, crying poverty to his mother while maintaining a lifestyle he can't afford. "The financial records show he makes enough to live comfortably. He just refuses to adjust his spending to match his actual income rather than his desired image." When court resumed, Patricia's cross-examination of David was surgical in its precision. Presented with his own financial records, he had no choice but to admit the discrepancies. "You told your mother you were drowning financially," Patricia said, consulting her notes. "Yet these records show you spent $15,000 on golf club fees this year alone." That's for business networking," David stammered. "And the $40,000 down payment on a second home? An investment property you described to your mother as a financial burden you couldn't afford?" David's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the damage was done. The court could see clearly that David's financial crisis was self-manufactured, designed to manipulate his mother into providing funds for a lifestyle he felt entitled to maintain. The afternoon brought Jake and Emma Mitchell to the witness stand, not as planned testimony, but in response to Blackwood's decision to call them as hostile witnesses, apparently hoping their youth would make them easy to manipulate. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Jake, at 16, displayed the kind of thoughtful maturity that comes from genuine responsibility. When Blackwood tried to paint his family as opportunistic, Jake's response was devastating. "Mr. Blackwood, you keep asking if we planned this somehow. But how could we plan for someone to be kind to us? We didn't even know Mrs. Thompson well until she started helping with my math homework. She offered because she saw I was struggling, not because we asked." Emma's testimony was equally effective. though more emotional. When Blackwood suggested her family had manipulated Cecilia's grief, Emma's eyes filled with tears, not of shame, but of anger. Mrs. Thompson wasn't confused or sad when she made this decision, Emma said firmly. She was strong, stronger than she'd been in months. She told us she finally felt like she was honoring her husband's values instead of enabling behavior that made someone she loved become worse. The 16-year-old's articulation of complex family dynamics left the courtroom silent. Even Judge Hartwell seemed moved by the girl's obvious sincerity and insight. But perhaps the most powerful moment came from an unexpected source. Pastor Morrison, who hadn't been scheduled to testify, requested permission to address the court about the broader community impact. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd counseled families through decades of crises. "I've watched this situation unfold, not just as Sarah Mitchell's pastor, but as someone who cares about what kind of community we're building here." He paused, looking directly at David. David Thompson's argument seems to be that family obligation should override character evaluation. But what kind of message does that send? That blood relationship excuses unlimited poor behavior? That enabling destructive patterns is more important than rewarding genuine virtue? The pastor's final words resonated through the courtroom. Mrs. Thompson didn't choose strangers over family. She chose to expand her definition of family to include people who embody the values she and her late husband cherished. That's not mental illness. That's moral clarity. As the day concluded, even Blackwood seemed to recognize that his case was collapsing. The community support for the Mitchell family, combined with the evidence of David's deception about his financial situation, had created an insurmountable burden for the plaintiff. David sat slumped at his table, the mask of wounded victimhood finally slipping to reveal something closer to genuine recognition of his circumstances. For the first time in the proceedings, he looked less like an aggrieved son and more like someone beginning to understand the consequences of his choices. That evening, as Cecilia prepared for what would likely be the trial's final day, she felt something she hadn't experienced since William's death. The satisfaction of being surrounded by people who supported her, not for what she could give them, but for who she had chosen to become. Judge Hartwell took less than an hour to reach her decision. When court reconvened that afternoon, the gallery was packed with community members who'd followed the case through 3 days of testimony. Cecilia sat between Patricia and Frank, her hands folded in her lap with a calmness that surprised her. Whatever the verdict, she'd spoken her truth and defended her values. The outcome felt almost secondary to the peace that realization brought. "This case," Judge Hartwell began, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed her notes, "presents a fundamental question about the nature of family obligation and individual autonomy. The plaintiff argues that blood relationship creates an irrevocable claim on inheritance, regardless of character or conduct. The defendant maintains that genuine care and shared values can create family bonds that transcend genetics." David sat rigidly beside Blackwood, his face a careful mask that couldn't quite hide the desperation beneath. Over 3 days of testimony, his case had crumbled piece by piece, each witness revealing new aspects of a pattern he'd spent years trying to conceal. "The evidence presented here paints a clear picture," the judge continued. "Mrs. Cecilia Thompson is a 77-year-old. 67, Your Honor," Patricia corrected gently. "A 67-year-old woman of sound mind who made a deliberate, well-reasoned decision about the distribution of her late husband's assets. The psychological evaluation confirms her mental competency. The financial records demonstrate her clear understanding of the sums involved. The testimony reveals extensive documentation of her reasoning process." Cecilia felt Sarah's intake of breath from the row behind her. The Mitchell family had sat through every session, their presence both supportive and humble, never presumptuous about the outcome, despite the evidence in their favor. More significantly, Judge Hartwell said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd witnessed decades of family disputes, "The evidence reveals troubling patterns in the relationship between Mrs. Thompson and her son David. Financial records spanning 20 years show consistent requests for emergency assistance, followed by temporary gratitude, then repetition of the cycle. Character witnesses describe a relationship based primarily on financial dependency rather than mutual affection or respect. David's face had gone pale. For the first time since childhood, he was facing consequences he couldn't charm, manipulate, or buy his way out of. The recognition was written in every line of his posture. In contrast, testimony about the Mitchell family reveals precisely the kind of character Mrs. Thompson sought to support. Community members describe a family that contributes rather than extracts, that builds rather than consumes, that gives to others despite their own financial limitations. The judge paused, looking directly at David. The plaintiff's own children provided perhaps the most telling testimony, describing Mrs. Thompson's consistent interest in their lives and comparing it favorably to their father's more transactional approach to relationships. Cecilia felt a stab of pain for David, seeing him forced to confront truths he'd spent years avoiding. But she also felt something else. Hope that this reckoning might finally provide the catalyst for genuine change. Therefore, Judge Hartwell concluded, this court finds that Mrs. Thompson acted with full legal capacity and sound judgment in transferring the Thompson family trust to Sarah Mitchell and her children. The transfer is legally valid and will remain in effect. The plaintiff's petition is denied. The gavel's bang seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. In the gallery, quiet conversations erupted as community members processed the verdict. Sarah buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with relief and overwhelming gratitude. Jake and Emma flanked their mother, their teenage composure finally cracking as the magnitude of their new reality settled in. David sat motionless, staring at the judge's bench as if expecting a different reality to materialize. When he finally turned to look at his mother, his expression carried something she hadn't seen since his childhood: genuine vulnerability beneath the anger. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air felt crisp with possibility. Patricia handled the media questions, while Cecilia found herself surrounded by community members, offering congratulations and support. But her attention was focused on the small group gathered near the courthouse steps: Sarah, Jake, and Emma, standing together as they had throughout this ordeal. "Mrs. Thompson," Sarah said as Cecilia approached, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Cecilia replied simply, "by being exactly who you are." But the peaceful moment was shattered by David's voice, raised in fury as he confronted his mother one final time. "Are you satisfied now?" he shouted, drawing stares from everyone in the vicinity. "You've humiliated me publicly, destroyed my relationship with my children, and handed our family's legacy to strangers. I hope it was worth it." Cecilia turned to face her son, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time in decades. The charm was gone, the manipulation exhausted, leaving only the raw entitlement that had driven their relationship for so many years. "David," she said quietly, "you did this to yourself. Every choice, every broken promise, every time you saw me as a solution to problems you created, rather than a person who deserved love and respect. I didn't humiliate you. I simply stopped enabling you. They're not your family." David's voice cracked on the words. I'm your son." "Yes, you are my son," Cecilia agreed, and for a moment her voice carried all the love and pain of 42 years of motherhood. "But you've never been my family. Family supports each other. Family celebrates each other's successes and shares each other's burdens. Family doesn't see relationships as transactions or love as obligation." She gestured toward the Mitchell family, who stood nearby watching the confrontation with obvious discomfort. "They became my family by choice, by treating me as someone valuable beyond my bank account. You remained my son by accident of birth, while treating me as nothing more than a resource to exploit." David's face cycled through emotions: rage, disbelief, and something that might have been the first glimmer of self-recognition he'd experienced in years. "So, what am I supposed to do now?" he asked, and for the first time his voice carried genuine uncertainty rather than entitled demand. "What you should have done 20 years ago," Cecilia replied. "Learn to solve your own problems. Take responsibility for your choices. Stop expecting other people to rescue you from the consequences of your decisions." "And if I can't?" The question hung in the air between them. loaded with years of enabling and the possibility of change. Then you'll discover what kind of person you really are when no one's left to bail you out, Cecilia said. And maybe, eventually, you'll become someone worthy of the love you've taken for granted. David stared at his mother for a long moment. Then at the family she'd chosen to support, then back at her. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, though still edged with bitterness. "You've made your choice," he said. "Now you'll have to live with it." "Yes," Cecilia agreed. "I will. And for the first time in years, I'm confident I'll sleep peacefully doing so." David turned and walked away, his expensive suit rumpled, his perfect image finally matching the reality of his character. Cecilia watched him go, feeling not triumph but a complex mixture of relief and sadness. She'd saved her son from becoming worse than he already was, but she couldn't save him from the person he'd already become. That work, if it ever happened, would have to be his own. As the crowd dispersed and the afternoon faded into evening, Cecilia found herself walking home with an unexpected entourage. Frank and Patricia discussed legal details, while Sarah and the twins planned how to handle their new reality responsibly. The conversation swirled around her, but Cecilia felt detached from the practical considerations, focused instead on the profound sense of completion that settled in her chest. She'd honored William's values. She'd protected David from further enabling. She'd supported people who would use their opportunity to build rather than consume. Most importantly, she'd discovered that love, real love, sometimes required the courage to say no to people you cared about, in service of helping them become better than they currently were. The revolution that had begun with David's cruel words was complete. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the Mitchell family adjusted to their changed circumstances and David faced the consequences of a lifetime of poor choices. But tonight, Cecilia Thompson would sleep peacefully, surrounded by the love of people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could provide. The inheritance was settled. The real work of family, chosen family, was just beginning. 6 months after the courthouse steps confrontation, Millbrook Heights had settled into a new rhythm. The spring air carried the scent of blooming dogwoods and fresh possibility, as Cecilia walked across her back lawn toward the sound of laughter and conversation coming from the Mitchell property. The artificial boundary between their yards had become meaningless over the winter months, with pathways worn smooth by frequent visits and shared meals. Sarah's catering business, Mitchell Family Kitchens, had grown from a weekend venture into a thriving enterprise. The inheritance had provided the capital for a commercial-grade kitchen renovation, professional equipment, and the working capital needed to accept larger contracts. But more importantly, it had given Sarah the freedom to leave her hospital job and focus entirely on building something that could provide both financial security and creative satisfaction. "Cecilia," Emma called out as she spotted her approach. "Come see what Jake's been working on." The backyard had been transformed into an outdoor workspace where Jake was constructing what appeared to be an elaborate greenhouse. At 17 now, he'd grown taller over the winter, his confidence expanding along with his height. The early acceptance letter from MIT sat framed in their kitchen. But Jake had deferred enrollment for a year to help establish the family business and ensure Emma's art school applications were properly funded. "It's for your orchids," Jake explained, wiping sweat from his forehead as he adjusted a glass panel. "I noticed yours were running out of space, and Mom's herb garden keeps expanding. Figured we could share the space. Your orchids on one side, her specialized ingredients on the other." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, recognizing a need and addressing it without being asked, exemplified everything Cecilia had seen in this family from the beginning. Jake had absorbed the lesson that genuine care expresses itself through action rather than words. "The foundation work was trickier than I expected," Jake continued, his engineer's mind already apparent in how he approached problems. "But Mr. Henderson helped with the heavy lifting, and Pastor Morrison knew a contractor who gave us wholesale pricing on materials." Frank Henderson emerged from behind the greenhouse structure, tool belt around his waist, and a satisfied grin on his weathered face. At 73, he'd found new purpose in mentoring Jake, teaching him practical skills while learning about sustainable engineering techniques that hadn't existed during his own construction days. "Boy's got good instincts," Frank said, patting Jake's shoulder with genuine pride. Measured twice, cut once, and asked smart questions when he needed help. Reminds me of your William at that age. Always thinking 3 steps ahead. The comparison brought a warm feeling to Cecilia's chest. William would indeed have appreciated Jake's methodical approach and genuine consideration for others. In many ways, Jake embodied the values William had hoped to instill in David, but had never quite managed to cultivate. Speaking of which, Sarah said, emerging from the house with a tray of lemonade and sandwiches, Jake got his summer internship placement. MIT's early admission program includes a mentorship component with their engineering faculty. Jake's face lit up with quiet pride. It's basically shadowing Professor Martinez's sustainable architecture research. I'll be learning about green building techniques and energy-efficient design systems. Pays enough to cover my living expenses, and I'll be getting credit toward my degree. That's wonderful, Cecilia said, meaning it completely. Watching Jake navigate his opportunities with such maturity and forward thinking had become one of her greatest pleasures over the past months. Emma bounded over from where she'd been sketching the greenhouse construction, her portfolio case slung over one shoulder. And I got the Hartwell Scholarship for art school. Full tuition plus living expenses for all 4 years, renewable based on academic performance and community service requirements. The scholarship had been a surprise windfall. Margaret Hartwell, the judge who'd presided over their case, had established it years earlier for students who demonstrated both artistic talent and strong character. Emma's application essay about using art to build community connections had apparently resonated strongly with the selection committee. Which means, Sarah added, settling into one of the garden chairs Jake had built during the winter, we can use more of the inheritance for long-term investments rather than immediate education expenses. Jake wants to establish college funds for other kids in the community who might not otherwise have opportunities. The idea was pure Jake, taking his good fortune and finding ways to extend similar opportunities to others. It was exactly what Cecilia had hoped for when she'd made her decision about the inheritance. There's something else, Sarah said, her tone carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I've been invited to cater the Millbrook Heights Community Foundation's annual gala. It's their biggest fundraising event, and they specifically requested Mitchell Family Kitchens after hearing recommendations from several board members. The gala represented more than just a business opportunity. It was validation from the community's leadership that Sarah had established herself as a respected entrepreneur, rather than just a recipient of charity. The transformation from struggling single mother to successful business owner was nearly complete. Mrs. Patterson from the Arts Center wants Emma to create the centerpieces, Sarah continued. And Jake designed an efficient service system that'll allow us to handle an event that size without compromising quality. It's next month, Emma added excitedly. The theme is Building Community Through Shared Values, which is perfect because that's basically the story of how we all became family. Family, the word had evolved significantly in Cecilia's vocabulary over the past year. It no longer meant simply blood relation or legal obligation, but rather the network of people who chose to support each other's growth and celebrate each other's successes. Have you heard anything from David? Sarah asked gently, as if reading Cecilia's thoughts. The question didn't sting the way it once had. Cecilia had made peace with her son's choices and their consequences, though she still hoped he might eventually learn from them. He's working, she said simply. Jennifer told me he took a position with a smaller marketing firm, significant pay cut, but honest work with realistic expectations. He sold the Hampton house and the country club membership, living in a modest apartment now. The changes represented exactly what Cecilia had hoped the inheritance decision might precipitate. David was finally learning to live within his means, to solve problems through effort rather than manipulation, to face consequences instead of seeking bailouts. How are Marcus and Sophie handling everything? Frank asked. Better than expected, Cecilia replied. David's financial reality check has actually improved his relationship with them. He's more present now, more engaged with their actual lives, rather than trying to impress them with expensive gestures he couldn't afford. It was perhaps the case's most unexpected positive outcome. David's children were getting to know their father as a person rather than a provider, and both sides seemed to be benefiting from the more authentic relationship. "He sent a letter last week," Cecilia added quietly. "Nothing dramatic, just updates about the kids and his work." But it was the first communication that didn't include a request for money or a complaint about his circumstances. "That's progress," Sarah said diplomatically, though her expression suggested she had more complex feelings about David's evolution. "It is," Cecilia agreed. "Not the progress I spent 35 years hoping for, but progress nonetheless." The afternoon settled into comfortable conversation as they discussed Emma's upcoming art show, Jake's research projects, and Sarah's expanding client base. The easy dynamic between them had developed naturally over the winter months, not forced family bonding, but genuine affection built through shared experiences and mutual support. As evening approached, they moved the gathering inside to Sarah's kitchen, where the dinner preparations had become a collaborative effort. Jake handled the technical aspects of cooking with scientific precision. Emma contributed creative flair to presentation. Sarah managed coordination and timing, and Cecilia provided what she'd come to think of as institutional memory. Stories about family traditions and community history that helped ground their new relationships in deeper context. "I've been thinking," Cecilia said as they sat down to dinner, "about what William would make of all this." The others listened attentively. Over the months, Cecilia had shared enough stories about her late husband that he'd become a real presence in their family narrative, his values and wisdom helping guide their decisions. "I think he'd be proud of how you've used the inheritance," she continued, looking around the table at faces that had become as dear to her as any blood relatives. "But more than that, I think he'd be amazed by how much you've taught me." "Taught you?" Sarah asked, surprised. "About the difference between giving and enabling. About love that builds character rather than bypassing it. About family that's chosen rather than assumed." Cecilia paused, feeling the truth of her words settle in her chest. "You gave me permission to stop feeling guilty about setting boundaries, and to start feeling proud about supporting people who would use opportunities wisely." "You gave us opportunities we never dreamed possible," Jake replied seriously. "But you also gave us something more valuable, belief that we were worthy of those opportunities." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "It's like you saw who we could become before we saw it ourselves." "That's what family does," Frank added, raising his glass of iced tea in a toast. "Real family recognizes potential and creates space for it to flourish." As they raised their glasses together, Cecilia felt a profound sense of completion. The grief that had defined her life for so many months had transformed into something else. Not the absence of William, but the presence of the values they'd shared and the legacy they'd built together. After dinner, as they cleaned up with the same collaborative efficiency that had characterized the meal preparation, Emma pulled out her sketchbook and began drawing quick portraits of the evening's moments. Her artistic development had accelerated dramatically since starting advanced placement classes, but more importantly, her work had gained a depth of observation that spoke to genuine emotional maturity. "For the family album," she explained, showing Cecilia a sketch that captured Jake explaining some technical detail to Frank while Sarah listened with amused affection. "I want to document how we all fit together." The phrase struck Cecilia as perfect. They did fit together, not because they were supposed to, but because they'd chosen to. Each person's strengths complemented the other's needs, creating a whole that was more than the sum of its parts. Later, as Cecilia prepared to return to her own house, Sarah walked her to the door with the same careful attention she'd shown during those early months of grief. "Are you happy?" Sarah asked quietly. "Really happy, not just content or peaceful?" The question deserved careful consideration. Cecilia thought about the past year. The pain of recognizing David's true character, the courage required to defend her decision, the joy of watching Jake and Emma grow into their potential, the satisfaction of supporting people who honored rather than squandered opportunities. "Yes," she said finally, "I'm happy in ways I didn't know were possible. Not the happiness of having everything you want, but the happiness of wanting everything you have." Including David's situation? Including the hope that David's situation might eventually teach him what enabling never could. As Cecilia walked back across the now familiar path between their homes, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a grieving widow, convinced she had nothing left to give. Tonight, she was returning to a house that felt like home rather than a museum, surrounded by relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation, confident that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to support the people she'd chosen as family. The lights in the Mitchell house glowed warmly behind her, and through the windows she could see Jake helping Emma organize her art supplies, while Sarah reviewed catering contracts for the next day. Normal evening activities in a normal family home, made possible by extraordinary generosity but sustained by ordinary love. David had been wrong about so many things, but perhaps most fundamentally about what it meant to have something left to give. Cecilia hadn't run out of gifts to offer. She'd simply learned to give them more wisely, to people who would treasure rather than squander them, to relationships that would grow stronger rather than weaker under the weight of generosity. In her own kitchen, she made tea using herbs from Sarah's garden and sat in William's chair, her chair now, to review the day's mail. Among the bills and advertisements was a graduation announcement from Marcus, David's older son, who was finishing 8th grade with honors. The achievement was modest but real, and David had apparently thought to share it with her despite their complicated relationship. It was progress, she thought. Not reconciliation, certainly not absolution, but acknowledgement that family connections could survive even fundamental disagreements about values and choices. Marcus and Sophie were growing up with a clearer understanding of both their father's limitations and their grandmother's love, which felt like exactly the right foundation for whatever relationship might be possible in the future. The grandfather clock chimed 11, its voice no longer marking loss, but measuring the steady accumulation of new memories. Outside, the spring night was full of possibility. Sarah's business expanding, Jake and Emma preparing for their next educational adventures, Frank finding purpose in mentorship, and Cecilia herself discovering that the best years of a life could come after the hardest lessons were finally learned. She thought about William, as she did every evening, but tonight the memories brought comfort rather than pain. He would have approved of everything that had grown from his legacy, not just the financial inheritance, but the values it had been used to support and the relationships it had helped nurture. "You were right about family," she whispered to the quiet house. "It's not about blood or obligation. It's about choosing to see the best in each other and helping that best become real. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. Sarah's catering business would continue growing, requiring decisions about expansion and employee hiring. Jake would begin his internship program, taking his first real steps toward the engineering career that would let him build solutions to problems he couldn't yet imagine. Emma would finish her scholarship applications and prepare for art school, her creativity already finding ways to strengthen the community around her. And Cecilia would continue learning what it meant to be part of a chosen family, contributing her wisdom and resources while receiving the kind of love that asked for nothing in return except the chance to keep growing together. The revolution that had begun with David's cruel dismissal was complete. What remained was the steady, satisfying work of building something beautiful from the ruins of what had never worked anyway. Cecilia Thompson smiled in the darkness, surrounded by the peace that comes from finally understanding the difference between having nothing left to give and having everything worth sharing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote.